Hello everybody, it's me Julian, and today I would like to talk about love without the fall and how it relates to Slavoj Žižek's argument that love is a violent event. Now, first of all, love without the fall is a conceptual argument that is derived from Alain Badiou's theory of love and the event. The argument that he makes is fairly simple, although as per usual there's an obvious explanation and a more philosophical one. The obvious explanation is that in today's society, we're afraid of falling in love. In fact, it's become easy to hook up with people online, and there's multiple dating apps. But when it comes to genuine romantic attachments, we really struggle. In fact, it seems like we've lost the ability to articulate what love really means. And so the paradox is that it is easier than ever before to meet people, but it is harder than ever before to make an authentic connection. Therefore, Alain Badiou argues that we've become afraid of love in the sense that we worry that love will hurt us. We worry that it will disrupt us, that it will take away our happiness. In fact, if the incentive structure of contemporary life is to be happy and productive, or at least to learn how to perform happiness and productivity, then love presents itself as a threat. Nothing makes you less happy and less productive than falling in love and not knowing if they love you back. Before you know it, you become the hysterical romantic, plucking the petals of a flower, asking yourself, does she love me? Does she love me not? Indeed, as Plato already said, love has the ability to turn otherwise rational men into fools. We become fools for love. And fearing becoming fools for love, we therefore want a neutered love. We want a love without the fall. Therefore, Alain Badiou essentially characterizes the wish or the desire for a love without the fall as being symptomatic of a society in which people want substitutes for the real thing. We want coffee without caffeine. We want sweets without sugar. And fundamentally, therefore, wanting love without the fall presents itself as an addition in this lineup. We want the thing, but we're afraid of the actual content of the thing. We want a neutered version of it that can be integrated into our life. And this idea of love without the fall relates to Slavoj Žižek's theory that love is a violent event. It's a characteristically provocative argument, at least at first sight. We usually think of love as being romantic and sweet and about seeing the world through rose-tinted glasses. And so why does Slavoj Žižek argue that love is violent? Well, the key thing here is that he's essentially making the argument that love radically disorients the subject. When we fall in love, suddenly nothing makes sense. We're awake at night. We can't sleep. We're unhappy unless we're with that person. Love is therefore the process by which the subject loses himself, so as also to, in a sense, find himself. Žižek therefore likens falling in love to the Hegelian concept of the night of the world, or die Nacht im Menschen. It's a radical unknown, a desubjectivizing force that we enter into, and yet paradoxically it seems that by means of falling in love, we find out who we really are and what we're really made of. In this sense, there's actually an analogy to be made between war and love. Hegel characterized war as being similar to the night of the world. In war, we have a suspension of the ethics of good and evil, and we find ourselves in a battle for survival in which we find out who we really are. The same happens in love. We have a quote-unquote suspension of the ethical. Suddenly the world is upside down and we no longer know who we are or what matters to us. We act in a way in which we don't recognize ourselves. To put this in more technical terms, Slavoj Žižek says that love therefore presents itself as a transition from experienced contingency into realized necessity. Experienced contingency is the process by which we meet a stranger, somebody we don't know, who we nevertheless fall in love with, and now when we're in love with them, we experience it as a necessity, i.e. as fate. Indeed, when two people love each other, they'll often recite to strangers or friends how they met, essentially rehearsing their own origin story to make it seem like it was destined to be. And what's key here is that you don't even have to believe that you are soulmates. You don't have to believe that you were destined to meet. Strictly speaking, you could probably fall in love with most people, or perhaps with another person just like them. And yet this process by which an otherwise contingent experience is realized by the subject as a necessity, is therefore the process by which you go from an accidental meeting into what appears to you as fate. And for Slavoj Žižek, the transition from contingency to necessity is also the basic formula for a revolutionary act. A revolution always presents itself at first as accidental, as unexpected, and the next day it starts to ratify itself as being necessary. This happens to a degree with every political event. The day before an election, we don't know who is going to win, and yet the day after the election, we start pretending as if it was always inevitable that the candidate who has won was indeed the victor. The same is true with the fall of the Berlin Wall. We thought it would never happen until suddenly it appeared to be inevitable. This transition from possibility into actuality is therefore the formula of love that lies at the heart of all revolutionary change and potential. Therefore, when Slavoj Žižek argues that love is a violent event, he means it in the sense that it is something which has the possibility to change the very coordinates of how we experience reality, and what could be more violent than that. In fact, Slavoj Žižek's theory of violence holds that true violence is never simply outward displays of force. Instead, it's about invisible structural violence that we, in a sense, take for granted, that we don't even notice. Therefore, violence isn't simply about physical force. Violence is about the capacity to which we accept the world as it is, or we transform the world as it is, which is a fancy way of saying that for Slavoj Žižek, the truest form of violence is the violence to change the way in which we perceive reality. Therefore, love is a violent event. It changes the way in which we not only experience reality, but perhaps more importantly, the way in which we experience ourselves. I'd like to briefly focus on the second part of the explanation, which is love is a violent event. It's not just violent, it's also an event. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Alain Badiou, you will recognize here Badiou's theory of the event. And Badiou's theory of the event follows a similar formula of the experience of contingency transformed into necessity. The way that Badiou puts it is like this. An event is an otherwise contingent occurrence in which the subject appears to recognize himself, like a call from the wild, so to speak. In this sense, love presents itself as an event because it isn't love unless the subject recognizes himself in it. In fact, this is the crucial stage of infatuation, of falling in love, as Nietzsche once called it, when you fall in love with the idea of love itself, which is to say a circumstance presents itself to you in which you feel like you're falling in love. And yet, nevertheless, unless you act upon it, unless you ask the other person out, unless you, in a sense, force the situation, it isn't love. It's simply the passing, fleeting potential of love. Love, therefore, puts the subject in a very difficult double bind, which is to say that on the one hand, he experiences it passively, but on the other, he also has to take a Kierkegaardian leap of faith, a leap into the unknown, or as I said before, the night of the world, in which he risks everything so as to gain everything. This means that love presents itself as an ethical obligation of sorts. We find ourselves in love, and yet we have to choose whether or not we act upon it. Hence the trope from romantic comedies in which a character recognizes in the final act that he does indeed love the woman and then runs all the way back to her. This moment of separation, this moment of ethical doubt, where the subject undergoes a transition from being the passive recipient of the love event towards the active incumbent of it, is therefore once again the transition from contingency to necessity. In a sense, the subject has to choose love. He has to actualize it so as to properly inhabit it. And once again, we're back at a revolutionary theory. Likewise, revolution isn't simply something that happens to the subject. It's that at a certain point, the subject hears himself, sees himself in the call of the other, in the call of the historical moment. Slavoj Žižek has a beautiful argument about freedom that relates in the sense directly to love. He says, imagine that somebody passes out in the street and nobody wants to help them, and all of a sudden someone shows up, a young man, and he calls an ambulance and brings the person to the hospital. Later, a local reporter asks him, why were you the hero? Why did you choose to intervene when nobody else would? And his response is quite simple. Well, I didn't have a choice. And of course, in a sense, the man did have a choice. Everybody else chose to simply keep on walking. And yet, in this moment, an event presented itself to the man, which is that in the situation that arose, he saw a necessity for his own action. Therefore, what was a deeply subjective choice to act presented itself to him as an inevitability, a transition from contingency to necessity. And for Slavoj Žižek, this is the core of all subjectivity. A moment in which we realize that we have to act, that we have to step in. We realize who we are and how we believe we must act. Freedom, therefore, paradoxically, isn't the freedom to be able to do anything, but to recognize oneself in a situation in which there is only one way in which one believes one has to act. And finally, this is also why Slavoj Žižek argues that to be in a committed relationship is perhaps the ultimate form of rebellion. Indeed, that to be committed to a partnership over time is a small revolution in its own right, which is to say, to do something that goes above and beyond yourself, to commit yourself to something that is higher than yourself. In fact, romantic love for Slavoj Žižek is precisely about this commitment. It's not just a feeling, as Erich Fromm once said, it's a practice, in the same way that revolution isn't simply a feeling that you can print on a t-shirt. It is a practice. It is a process in which the subject realizes his own inner and historical necessity. Now, I'd like to end briefly with Slavoj Žižek's idea of an ideal date, which is characteristically Žižekian and perhaps seemingly unromantic and yet surprisingly so. Slavoj Žižek says that for him the ideal date would be to go home with a woman and for both of them to pull out their sex toys, to plug them in, and then to let the sex toys pleasure each other so that they can go outside and read books together. That is the height of romantic love for Slavoj Žižek, to leave aside the sexual act and to enjoy the intellectual stimulation of being with each other, committed to the philosophical cause. Thank you so much for watching my video. Please don't forget to become a patron. I'll see you tomorrow.